Philosophers today like to describe themselves as doing philosophy. Though perhaps obliquely self-congratulatory, this expression makes plain the image they have of themselves as philosophers rather than merely teachers of philosophy, contributors rather than mere transmitters, creators rather than scholars or historians of philosophy. But in addition, it implies something about the nature of philosophy itself as they've come to see it, as something one engages in rather than something one possesses, an activity rather than a set of ultimate beliefs or doctrines. Hence, even teaching philosophy, and most professional philosophers teach, consists not so much in conveying a body of facts as instructing in the exercise of a kind of skill. To be a philosopher is to be master of these skills and to apply them to the hopeful solution of the problems of philosophy, rather than to be a wise man or a guru or the holder of some dark and arcane teaching or the learned compendiast of the great dead systems. The saying, philosophy is not a doctrine but an activity, comes from Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which was written in 1922. Professor Malcolm will be speaking on Wittgenstein, but I preempt a bit his prerogatives to introduce my topic. Wittgenstein meant by it something rather deeper than the sunny, athletic connotations of the fashionable phrase I've just quoted. It was Wittgenstein's claim that in the sense in which philosophers of the misguided past had sought for theories and doctrines of some profound ultimate sort, there are no philosophical theories and doctrines. So the activity in which philosophy, exclusively according to him, consists does not terminate, as do most intellectual activities, in the framing of propositions or the establishment of facts. For again, in that sense, there are no philosophical as there are chemical propositions, and no philosophical as there are historical facts. Philosophy, as he put it, is not one of the sciences. Its activity is elucidatory and analytical, and in the primary respect in which the sciences tell us something about the world, philosophy, properly understood, tells us nothing. So insofar as philosophers should have thought themselves committed to the task of saying something about the world, or even to have succeeded in the achievement of this task, they've been radically misled. The cause of their having been so, Wittgenstein diagnosed as a misapprehension of language. Indeed, what philosophers traditionally took to be a statement about the world, when it was not merely proto-science, and this was often the case in pre-modern times when the distinction between philosophy and science was not quite clear, when it was not that, it was really, according to him, statement about language masquerading as a statement about the world. The elucidatory effort of philosophy, as henceforward appreciated by Wittgenstein, was to penetrate this disguise, to show what really was being said, to show that what was really being said was neither true nor false in the ordinary way in which scientific statements are true or false. And through such elucidations, Wittgenstein proposed to show that the problems of philosophy arose only because of these disguises, that the problems are not genuine, that are neither difficult but soluble, nor complicated and insoluble, but that when they are exhibited in their correct form, they vanish, as it were, into nothingness. There is in this a therapeutic possibility, and therapy could never have been very remote from Wittgenstein's thought, rather closely congruent with a familiar model in clinical psychoanalysis. The neurotic is one whose real concerns have become displaced and disguised, and once the disguise has been made transparent, the problem which tormented the patient cannot any longer be seriously framed by him. It would not have been solved, but only dissolved through bringing him to the realization of its spuriousness. To continue to press for answers is to remain in the state of neurotic dislocation, for perceiving the inappropriateness of seeking answers comes directly with the dissipation of the agonizing enchantment. Therapeutic analysis in philosophy, then, would bring not the illumination which comes with information, but rather with the realization that to suppose information possible is radically to have been misled on the nature of one's questions. These views of Wittgenstein can lead, as indeed they did historically lead, to some depressing vulgarizations. I'm not so much concerned to defend them against either allies or enemies, as to stress that it is against their background that we must appreciate the pattern and image of philosophizing which my contemporaries do when they, quote, do philosophy. Wittgenstein wrote, "Language disguises thought," and elaborated upon this as meaning that one cannot always tell from the form of a proposition what that proposition really expresses. The elucidations of philosophy would then not consist in the assertion, but rather in the exhibition of the real form of a proposition after having stripped away, by means of a technique of analysis, the camouflaging husks of external linguistic expression and misleading syntactical shape. Once revealed in its proper but obviously evasive true form, it should no longer be possible to take it as one would originally have been tempted to take it when it was in its pre-analytical travesti. This seeking after the real form of propositions is, in its various ways, what the activity of analytical philosophy has largely consisted in over the past several decades. Because it is this sort of activity, it's not easy to describe analytical philosophy by noting any of its characteristics or defining theses, as one is able in a way to do with Platonism or existentialism or the typical school of philosophic thought. Unless it is, after all, a distinctive thesis that there is a tacitly held deep difference between appearance and reality, here taken as a difference which is hardly a novel philosophical idea, here taken as a difference between the real and the apparent form of a proposition, and perhaps again, the quest for enlightenment and release from illusion, which is not a novel philosophical ambition, might be reproduced in the subsiding of an impulse to pose questions whose seeming genuineness is due only to the charm of misapprehended speech. Finally, as we may see, it's difficult to suppose that in the structural rectification of logical form, something is not after all being said, if only negatively and indirectly, about the world. For suppose that only through our victimization by the disguises of language, and for no other reason, we are led to believe the world to contain entities, say, of a certain kind. Then, in the reversion to a kind of linguistic purity, there is at once a reversion to a metaphysical purity as well, for with the revelation of the true form of a proposition goes the former inclination to postulate these dubious entities. To be sure, one's not talking about the world when one talks about it this way in the manner of a scientist. Rather, one would be saying that apart from what science, very broadly construed, might tell us, there's nothing about the world to say. To say that science is correct is not, of course, to make a further scientific statement. So in the end, as Wittgenstein phrased it, the word philosophy means something which stands above or below, but not beside, the natural sciences. Science talks about the world, and philosophy talks about talking about the world. As it happens, Wittgenstein didn't precisely restrain himself from talking about the world in a certain way. The Tractatus begins with this statement: "The world is the totality of facts, not things." Yet this isn't inconsistent with his theory as it might appear to be. As he saw the matter, then, facts correspond to sentences, ideally, in such a way that when we've exhibited the form of our basic sentences, we will have succeeded also in exhibiting the form of the basic facts. But this congruity between facts and sentences is not a further basic fact. A statement regarding the connection between language and the world is not purely about language, nor is it purely about the world. And in a language which exactly reflects the world, only the world and not the relation between the world and its linguistic reflection could be shown. And since philosophy is exactly concerned with that relationship, in such a language there'd be no room for philosophy. So philosophy would dissolve itself away in resolving the relationship between language and the world. The conception of philosophy as a certain sort of analysis of propositions is perhaps more than to any other philosopher due to Bertrand Russell. Russell's merit, Wittgenstein wrote, is to have shown that the apparent logical form of the proposition need not be its real form. As a general idea, comparable things may have been said before in the history of philosophy, but as Kant once said, when his own work was criticized in those terms, it's easy enough for critics of his originality to see in history everything he said, now that he said it, though men had not the wit to see it there before. And it's at any rate the way in which Russell went about it which is especially exciting. I want to illustrate Russell's contribution by briefly explaining Russell's celebrated theory of descriptions. Russell was concerned for reasons quite different from those which would motivate a grammarian, with expressions employing the definite article. For example, such expressions as the so-and-so, the lowest prime number, the only even prime number, the present King of France. Such expressions, termed definite descriptions, appear to function more or less as names function. That is to say, by making reference uniquely to just one individual. Thus, we might take the force of the proper name and of the definite description to be the same in the following pair of sentences. George Washington was honest, which uses the proper name George Washington, and the first president of the United States was honest, which uses the definite description, the first president of the United States. Suppose then, as parity of grammatical form suggests, definite descriptions may be treated as on a footing with proper names. Well, it's a natural suggestion that the meaning of a name just must be the individual the name denotes. The actual person, George Washington, would be what the name George Washington means. Indeed, it's been seriously argued that if a word lacks a denotation, it can't be a name. And in the case of names, since they have no meaning other than the individuals which bear them, they have no meaning at all and collapse into mere noises when they fail to denote. If definite descriptions are of a piece with names, this holds for definite descriptions as well. And that would be a sound and natural theory of names as well as definite descriptions, were it not for such a sentence as this: the present Duke of New York is embittered. A sentence we understand well enough despite the fact that there being no Duke of New York, we ought to be unable to do. For on the theory of meaning for names, and the theory which equates definite descriptions with names, that sentence is meaningless since its subject is meaningless. It's interesting to see how philosophers have responded to this, taking the theory of meaning and naming to be correct, and counting that sentence meaningful as it plainly is. They've concluded that there must, after all, be somehow a Duke of New York for the definite description to denote, since it's meaningful. Well, by similar considerations, there must be the man who squares a circle in order for the sentence, the man who squares the circle does not exist, to be a meaningful sentence. And it seems merely perverse to insist upon the existence of that which we want to deny it to exist in order that our denial should be meaningful. By taking that tack, obviously, we populate the universe with a class of philosophical monstrosities. Such an impasse as this was encountered very early in the history of philosophical thought. The ancients were troubled in much this way by false propositions. If the meaning of propositions is that state of affairs the proposition describes, which is a very natural theory, then either false propositions are meaningless, since there is no state of affairs they can describe, or there are no false propositions. The former alternative sounds strange, since we understand sentences independently of whether they're true or false. And the latter alternative also seems undesirable. It was, as it happens, the alternative which was adopted by a sophist named Protagoras, who concluded that since there are no false propositions, nobody's ever really wrong, so each man is the measure of what is. Some of the most philosophically interesting contests in history are those related in the dialogues of Plato between Socrates and Protagoras, or some representative Protagoras, where Socrates finds it crucial to suppose that men can significantly be wrong, that there can be meaningful false propositions, that it simply isn't the case that what each man thinks is right. For how then can one man be intellectually or morally superior to another man, and how can there be any proper public knowledge? It can't be said that great success in the solution of this rather venerable problem was attained before Russell's work, which is a measure of the importance one is justified in attaching to it. Russell's move was not to say that there must be an entity for the expression, the present Duke of New York, and like expressions to denote, but rather that the expression is not a denoting expression, and hence not really like a name at all. He proposed an analysis of the definite article, according to which, when we speak of the so-and-so, the present Duke of New York, or whom you will, we are saying that there is at least one so-and-so, and at most one so-and-so. And the sentence, quote, the present Duke of New York is embittered, that sentence really amounts not to one, but in effect to three distinct sentences. And if we unpack it along the lines suggested by Russell, the sentence becomes this: there is at least one Duke of New York, and at most one Duke of New York, and whomever the Duke of New York may be, that individual is embittered. Now that sentence has three ways of being false. It can be false if there is no Duke of New York, or if there are two or more Dukes of New York, or if there's one unembittered Duke of New York. We can now deny that there is a Duke of New York without, or at least deny the sentence that the Duke of New York is embittered, without being required to suppose that there is one, namely a Duke of New York, for our sentence to make sense or to have meaning. And we can do so because what appeared to be a referring expression of a grammatical piece with a name has disappeared in the analysis altogether. For it must be noted that in the translation Russell provides, the expression, the Duke of New York, has altogether disappeared. Even more striking is the fact that whereas our sentence originally appeared to be what logicians term a singular proposition, that is to say, a proposition which seems to be about a single individual, it turns out upon analysis to have been a general proposition referring not to any single individual, but generally to some individual or to all individuals in a general way. And that would be quite conspicuous to you if you were to see the translation fully written out. Fully written out, Russell's translation would be something like this: there is some X such that X is a Duke of New York, and for all Y, if Y is a Duke of New York, Y is identical with X, and X is embittered. Now, in showing that the manifest form of the proposition was not its real form at all, more than a reconstruction of the original will have been achieved. For in the original, a question naturally arises as to what must the subject of the sentence refer. And, assuming a wholly plausible theory of meaning for referring expressions, something had to be found in order to explain the meaningfulness of the proposition. Meaningfulness was preserved at the cost of a rather dangerous inflation of the inventory of the universe. But in its recovered form, the earlier question no longer arises. The referring expression, the so-and-so, has been dissolved with no loss of meaning. So in reforming language, Russell has after all gone beyond language in a way, purifying the universe of Manhattan nobility and of never-to-be-born squares of the circle. And since it's generally accepted task of philosophy to give a general itemizing of what there is, Russell's theory must be counted a contribution to this. To be sure, there may in some queer corner of the universe be round squares and barons of Scarsdale and unicorns, but at least we're not required to suppose the existence of these things or that queer corner merely in order to be able meaningfully to deny their existence. You may decry some of my scruples, writes Nelson Goodman, who is a leading American philosopher, and protest that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in my philosophy. I am concerned rather that there should not be more things dreamt of in my philosophy than there are in heaven and earth. Wittgenstein proposed in the Tractatus that to understand a proposition means to know what is the case if it is true. The logical positivists who adopted a variant of this thesis transformed it into the proposal that if you cannot say when a proposition is either true or false, then it's meaningless. With the difficulties and refinements of this theory of meaningfulness, I shall not be concerned. Rather, I wish only to draw attention to the stress which Wittgenstein's and the positivists' theories placed upon those uses of language where truth and falsity seem particularly germane, and hence upon the primarily descriptive offices of sentences. The success of the theory of descriptions in dissolving what appears to have been a problem through a logico-grammatical reconstruction of language encouraged a broad program of total linguistic reconstitution, hopefully to achieve a philosophically ideal, a logically perfect language in which the perplexities and infelicities of traditional philosophy as then seen could not arise, in which paradoxes could not be generated as they presumably could be in ordinary language. Such a language would be primarily descriptive and would in the end give us a finally perfected picture of how the world must be, or how we must be obliged to conceive of it given a logically optimal idiom. These emphases upon the descriptive function of language and upon the ideal artificial language philosophers began hopefully to construct went hand in hand with a general disparagement of non-descriptive uses as meaningless and natural languages as uncouth. It's an irony of intellectual history that but a few decades after Russell's triumph, there has come about, for reasons I can't specify here, but which plainly belong to the intellectual history of the 20th century, an almost absolute reversal of these programs. The philosophical importance of description has been impugned along with the virtual apotheosis of ordinary language, not only as philosophically satisfactory, but as virtually sacrosanct. An intellectual leader of this counter-movement, the late Oxford professor J.L. Austin, wrote in a famous paper, "Our common stock of words embodies all the distinctions men have found worth drawing and the connections they have found worth marking in the lifetimes of many generations. These surely are likely to be more numerous, more sound, since they have stood up to the long test of the survival of the fittest, and more subtle, at least in all ordinary and reasonably practical matters, than any you and I are likely to think up in our armchairs of an afternoon, the most favored alternative method. Austin's own work consisted very often in scrupulously exact descriptions of, to quote him, what we say when, and so why, and what we should mean by it. Close quote. And in a superficial way, this leads to what seems to many people as a reduction of philosophy to a kind of Boswellian status as a preserver and observer of the very contours of the plain man's plain speech, a rather unedifying enterprise and a rather wretched decline. But in the hands of a master, which Austin was, the distinctions he carefully noted are deeply relevant to the philosophical problems, or some philosophical problems, of the most depressing longevity. And the description of ordinary usage went thus with an extraordinary accompanying excitement that perhaps here release of the sort promised by Wittgenstein's program was at hand. Once more, a distinction between linguistic appearance and linguistic reality is marked. But this time, it's between a discrepancy between real and apparent uses rather than real and apparent forms of propositions. And that when this discrepancy is removed, the problem should be dissolved. I shall offer now a very brief description of one of Austin's most interesting attacks upon a problem which has certainly occupied philosophers from the beginning, the problem, namely, what is knowledge? According to Austin, when I use the sentence, I know that S, let S be any sentence you choose, I am, appearances notwithstanding, not saying anything at all about myself. I'm not reporting some such fact as that I am in a state of knowing, and I'm doing neither of these things because I am not saying or reporting anything at all. To suppose I am doing these things is to be dominated by the descriptive model of propositional meaning. But consider the sentence, I promise I will meet you at 10. Am I describing anything with that sentence? Am I reporting anything with that sentence? And if I am I describing or reporting a promise? Clearly not. I am making, not describing, a promise. It's Austin's thesis that there is a class of what he termed performative utterances, forms of words with which one executes certain actions, that is to say, as a priest actually performs the act of marrying a couple by the verbal act of pronouncing them man and wife. I pronounce you man and wife is not a description, but a performance. Austin proposed that with the form of words, quote, I know, I'm performing in this way. With it, in contrast with the form of words, I believe, as with I promise, in contrast with I fully intend, the speaker gives his word, and hence licenses others to act in the light of what he says. Should what a man says he knows prove false, he is blameworthy, as he would not have been had he used instead some less committing speech like, I believe, or it seems to me. Just as, according to Austin, when you say, I promise, and you don't keep it, you're blameworthy in a way in which you're not when you say, I fully intend. If you can't keep your promises, don't make them. If you're not sure, don't say you know. With I know, I take a special plunge, as Austin puts it, but I don't report any special fact, and certainly no fact different from what would have been reported with I believe that S. But philosophers, misled by the seeming descriptive form of I know that S, went searching for some special cognitive state which I know must report, and failing to find it, found knowledge altogether puzzling. But when it's seen as performative rather than descriptive, the search must cease, and such despairs as one might have abate. Austin's theory here is stunning and daring, in that it hoped, by mere re-identification of usage, to wash away a problem as old as philosophy. Austin's analysis is not, I believe, finally correct. This is not to be held against him, philosophy being the It breaks down badly when we shift from first person to third person use, and it's at any rate far from plain that a sentence cannot play, all at once, a variety of roles, be performative as well as descriptive. And if this is so, then the discovery that some sentences are performative, while interesting, is not as philosophically redemptive as might have been hoped. Austin, in a way particularly his own, reflected a later theory of Wittgenstein, namely that the meaning of a sentence is its use in a specific social context. So to understand a language is to understand how language operates. It's to understand a language, as Wittgenstein said, is to understand a form of life. Carried to an extreme, such a theory must represent language as a set of instruments for social interaction, rather than, as Wittgenstein in the earlier book conceived of it, as a mirror for reflecting reality. And doubtless, the logically perfect language of the earlier conception would be radically imperfect for the social facilitations of ordinary speech. But with this reversal of criteria for ideality, of course, goes a difference in the conception of philosophy, and perhaps a difference finally in the conception of man, as a describer of the world concerned primordially with knowledge, or as an agent primordially concerned with action, the subject, respectively, of a critique of pure or a critique of practical reason. Since the philosophy that American philosophers these days do follows either in the path of Russell and is technical and reconstructive, or in the path of Austin and is informal and descriptive, it might be stressed that the differences are not so metaphysically neutral as they might at first appear. There may be some different tacit commitment, after all, as to how the world is and how we are in it, disguised under what might seem merely a difference in how best to achieve conceptual clarity. And this, if so, means that the view of philosophy is purely elucidatory, the question only being as to which manner of elucidation we're to use, logical reconstruction or linguistic description. That view is not altogether free from doctrinal presuppositions which collect into rival metaphysics when made at last explicit. So it may be analytical philosophy is not without its philosophy, or philosophies after all. Be this as it may, the work of philosophy is likely to be carried out for some while as the attempt, through linguistic analysis, to attain an understanding of the real form of propositions, of what they really say, or what we really say by means of them, or do by means of them. And this work is likely to be technical and minute. Philosophers tend to write for one another, and there's little doubt that the ordinary intelligent reader must equip himself with a certain measure of technical training in order to follow their discussions. This has aroused rather a surprising hostility in recent years, and accusations have been made that philosophy has forsaken its traditional prerogatives and has fallen into the hands of technicians. True, philosophers have become professionalized and brisk and rather embarrassedly sidestep opportunities to sound edifying or profound. In consequence, the titles and styles of the papers are often deliberately irreverent, and their examples often intentionally comical or banal. Laymen who expect to be elevated or instructed in the grander harmonies or initiated in the meanings of life and death feel naturally offended and cheated by this combination of technicality and breeziness. But analytical philosophy is the frontier of conceptual investigation, and I, for my part, find it intoxicating. As Austin wrote, I owe it to the subject to say that it has long offered me what philosophy has thought and made barren of, the fun of discovery, the pleasures of cooperation, and the satisfaction of reaching agreement. Thank you.